So what's going to happen today is I'm going to talk about metaphysics, a very challenging and daunting subject. And a lot of it is going to be in Schuon's own words. This makes things a little more difficult to follow, perhaps, and perhaps requires a little more concentration than the previous. What is metaphysics? Well, if you go into a philosophy department in a university and confront one of the philosophers there and say, what is metaphysics? You're likely to get a bit of a shuffle, a bit of muttering about deep and recondite subjects, being, time, knowledge. Try and pin them down a bit and say, well, no, that doesn't, we know philosophy deals with all of this. What's metaphysics? The answer you'll probably get in slightly more elaborated, jargon-filled language is something to do with, well, it's to do with deep and difficult subjects that we can't really pin down with logic or with empirical evidence. In other words, subjects that are really too difficult for us. We can't really quite manage them. They're mysterious things. So metaphysics in contemporary philosophical discourse, it's a very vague term. It's almost meaningless. So that won't do. Or you might get an answer along these lines. Famous quote, famous passage from Voltaire. Is Voltaire a reliable source, a reliable authority on metaphysics? Well, you judge for yourself. Here's what he said. When he to whom one speaks does not understand, and he himself who speaks does not understand, this is metaphysics. Someone's talking in mumbo jumbo and his interlocutor is finding it quite unintelligible. That's metaphysics. Or here's Kant. Metaphysics is a dark ocean without shores or lighthouses, strewn with many a philosophical wreck. Metaphysics, in other words, dangerous territory, liable to get yourself into all sorts of trouble if you venture there too. Bradley, the philosopher F.H. Bradley. Metaphysics is the finding of bad reasons for what we believe upon instinct. Not quite as damaging as the first two quotes, but still. So how can we define it? That's my purpose today, to try and define this difficult term metaphysics, and perhaps even more importantly, to ask the question, what is the relationship of metaphysics to spiritual life? So to state it as simply as possible, and to borrow a phrase from Dr. Nasser, metaphysics is the science of the real. Metaphysics is the science of the real with a capital R. Now, if we go out there and ask the man or woman in the street, what's real? They're likely to pick a stone up. And here, this is real. This is real. Real almost is a synonym for material, for matter. We take matter to be real. That's the real thing, isn't it? All the rest we're not too sure about. Well, of course, as I'm sure you all agree, and as it's evident from what I've said over the last 3 days, the material world is the least real. It's not unreal, but it's the least real. It's only relatively real. What we're interested in is what is absolutely real. And what is absolutely real is not subject to time and space. It is not subject to karma in Indian terms. It is not subject to contingency. It is immutable. There are certain truths that are accessible to us, difficult to reach perhaps, but accessible. Truths about this immutable supra-material reality. If we're materialists, of course, we say this is all nonsense. There's only the material world. Everyone knows that there are things that aren't material, like, let us say, a dream or emotions or something, ideas. The materialists say, well, yeah, we know that, but that's just epiphenomena. In other words, matter is the substrate of reality. Matter's the ground, and anything else arises from it. But what's ultimately real is matter. Well, from a metaphysical point of view, of course, this is back to front, upside down. What is real is that which is beyond matter, which is beyond time and space. So metaphysics is the science of the real. Here's a slightly more extended definition of it from Schuon. Metaphysics is the science of the absolute and of the true nature of things. It concerns universal realities considered objectively. Metaphysics has, as it were, two great dimensions. The one, ascending and dealing with universal principles and the distinction between the real and the illusory, and the other, descending and dealing, on the contrary, with the divine life in creaturely situations, and thus with the fundamental and secret divinity of beings and of things, for all is Atma in Hindu terms. So in other words, metaphysics is concerned both with transcendence and with immanence. The ascending to transcendence, the descending with immanence. Immanence being the manifestation of the divine reality in time and space in the material world. One branch of that sort of metaphysics is cosmology. Cosmology is really metaphysics applied to the visible world. Here's another passage from Dr. Nasser. It is a science, this was very challenging when I read it for the first time many years ago. It is a science as strict and as exact as mathematics, and with the same clarity and certitude, but one which can only be attained through intellectual intuition and not simply through ratiocination. It thus differs from philosophy as it is usually understood. This supreme science of the real is the only science that can distinguish between the absolute and the relative, appearance and reality. Moreover, importantly, this science exists as the esoteric dimension within every orthodox and integral tradition, and is united with a spiritual method derived totally from the tradition in question. So this relationship between metaphysics and tradition, particularly its esoteric stream, is very important. Another point, I should have said at the beginning, and I'm going to make 9 general statements about metaphysics, okay? I'm still on number 1. Number 1 is metaphysics is the science of the real. So that's what we're dealing with at the moment, okay? Another point under that canopy, so to speak, a metaphysical doctrine can never be exhaustive. It's always provisional, because the truth is ineffable and inexhaustible. So no one formulation can accommodate the truth, so to speak. The truth always goes beyond the formulation. Abhishektananda said, the mystery to which religion points overflows its limits, that of religion overflows its limits in every direction. Schuon says, every metaphysical formulation is but error in the face of the divine reality itself. A provisional, indispensable, salutary error, which, however, contains and communicates the virtuality of the truth. So again, that's sort of a little bit paradoxical, a little bit difficult to get your head around. Any formulation is limited, provisional, in some sense erroneous, but it contains, if it's a valid metaphysical formulation, it contains the truth. Another point, very important, I'm sure it's very obvious to you by now, maybe always has been, metaphysics is not a matter of ratiocination. It's not a matter of thinking. It's not a matter of mental gymnastics. It's not a matter of nocturnal lucubrations with furrowed brow. It's not a matter of endless analyses. The rational mind is a highly useful tool, and it is indispensable in metaphysics because it is necessary for the formulation and exposition of metaphysical truths. So we certainly don't want to throw reason away, but reason by itself will not take us there. Shankara. Where is my quote from Shankara? I can't find it, but it'll turn up. It'll turn up at some point in the next 5 or 10 minutes. So reason must be our servant, not our master, when we're dealing with metaphysical questions. Of course, that doesn't mean that a metaphysician is entitled to irrationality, as Schuon points out. Nor does it mean that the great metaphysicians are in any way deficient in this department, rationality. Anyone who's read Shankara or Nagarjuna will know that these people are capable of dialectics of reasoning of the most sophisticated kind. Last point under the first big heading, metaphysics can be expressed in many different ways. I expect most of us, I speak for myself at least, expect metaphysical doctrine to be expounded in weighty tomes. But metaphysics can be expressed in all sorts of different ways. As I said the other day, the Native American Sundance is really a metaphysical exposition, a metaphysical ensemble, not in words on a printed page, but in symbolic ritual. Some of you will know of the Buddha's flower sermon. Buddha was asked questions about all sorts of mysterious and weighty matters. His answer was to hold a flower up in silence, a method deployed often by Zen masters. Metaphysics can be expressed in painting, in dance, in architecture, in all sorts of ways. So it's not just a matter of words on the page. Okay, so that's our first proposition. Metaphysics is the science of the real. Number 2, gnosis. That is to say, knowledge of the divine realities, knowledge of the sacred mysteries necessary for metaphysics. Gnosis arises through intellection within the protective embrace of a religious tradition. Gnosis arrives through intellection within the protective embrace of a religious tradition. So I talked a little bit the other day about intellection as a kind of spontaneous illumination, a spontaneous apprehension of suprasensorial realities. Schuon says, intellection or intellectual intuition is an activity of the intellect in which the illumination of universal knowledge is spontaneous and infallible. Big claim, big claim. Spontaneous and infallible. Moreover, it implies a certain detachment with regard to the world and the I, and demands a posteriori an exegesis conforming to its nature. So intellection takes place in individuals with what we might call contemplative intelligence, which is very different from mental cleverness. Dr. Nasser says contemplative intelligence differs from mental virtuosity as the flight of an eagle differs from the play of a monkey. Talking about 2 different things here. Someone might say, well, what about all of the mental faculties? What's the relationship between intellection, this apprehension of divine realities, sacred mystery? What's its relation to the other mental faculties, senses, whatever? Here's Schuon's answer. Although the intellect is situated beyond sentiment, beyond feeling, beyond imagination, beyond memory, beyond reason, It can at the same time enlighten and determine all of these, since they are like its individualised ramifications, ordained as receptacles to receive the light from on high and to translate it according to their respective capacities. So, in other words, a metaphysician might write poetry, use his or her imagination to write poetry, and something of the divine light will, so to speak, filter down and pervade the poetry. Okay, so here's a tricky point. Intellection has need of tradition and of revelation, except in the most abnormal circumstances, and they are so abnormal that we needn't worry about them. Except in the most abnormal circumstances, intellection takes place in a traditional milieu, in a traditional environment. This is Schuon. Intellection has need of tradition, of a revelation fixed in time and adapted to a society if it is to be awakened in us and not go astray. This is crucial. The importance of orthodoxy, of tradition, of revelation is that the means of realising the absolute must come objectively from the absolute. Knowledge cannot spring up subjectively except within the framework of an objective divine formulation of knowledge. Now, it's sometimes said that there are cases here and there of people who have no apparent connection with any tradition who undergo this kind of illumination. And Schuon concedes, so to speak, that this, and I quote, there are no metaphysical or cosmological reasons why, in exceptional cases, direct intellection should not arise in men who have no link at all with revealed wisdom, but an exception, if it proves the rule, assuredly should not constitute the rule. So, in other words, this is a very rare occurrence. The example that's often cited is not satisfactory. The example that's often cited is Ramana Maharshi, who appears to be just this kind of knockabout schoolboy doing schoolboy type things. And when he's age 15, he has a kind of death experience and emerges out the other side as a realised master. It's true that Ramana had no apparent interest in religion and had no particular proclivities in that direction, but he was exposed to, for example, the processions going to the temple in his village, the chants of the people, the recitations of the scriptures and so on. He might have not been taking any apparent notice, but he was in an environment saturated with Shivite Hinduism. So he's not really a very good example of this. I don't know that there are any examples really. There must be one here or two. The best one I can think of is Anandamayi Ma, who somehow seems to have been born. Somehow seems to have been born as in a realised state. An extraordinary story. If you don't know about Anandamayi Ma, she is absolutely worth further investigation. There's a book published by World Wisdom. What's it called, Michael? Yeah. That's the book. That's the book to go to if you're interested in her. Okay, we're up to number 3. Metaphysics commands a position of hierarchical superiority over both theology and philosophy, as well as all other modes of inquiry and knowledge. Well, this one might stir up a bit of a hornet's nest in some quarters. Hierarchic superiority over both theology and philosophy. Schuon again. Intellectual or metaphysical knowledge transcends the specifically theological point of view, which is itself incomparably superior to the philosophical point of view. Why is theology superior to philosophy? Because philosophy is merely man-made. Both metaphysics and theology come from God. So the hierarchy is metaphysics, theology, philosophy. It is incomparably superior to the theological point of view is itself incomparably superior to the philosophical point of view, since, like metaphysical knowledge, it emanates from God and not from man. Furthermore, I quote Kumaraswamy here, metaphysics comprises the infallible standard by which not only religions, but still more so philosophies and sciences must be corrected and interpreted. Metaphysics is the ultimate arbiter, so to speak, of the validity of any philosophical, theological, or scientific proposition. We want to get to the bottom of it, we must judge it by metaphysical criteria. Incidentally, some of you might say, well, metaphysics is all very well. Who are these people? Well, they're pretty few and far between. We need to make a distinction between metaphysicians and saints. There are plenty of saints who are not metaphysicians. A metaphysician is a person who has had this divine illumination, who has got this understanding of suprasensorial realities, who is also able to articulate one way or another the truths to which he or she has had access in a way intelligible to other people, and must be able to do so in a vocabulary that transcends the religious limits of the particular tradition to which they belong. In other words, a metaphysician must be able to speak a kind of universal language. Now, this is very, very rare. If you don't know anything about metaphysics and metaphysicians and you want to dive in at the deep end, I wouldn't suggest starting to read a metaphysician. You might get lost very quickly. Read a very good book written by my friend Reza Shah-Kazemi called Paths to Transcendence. Paths to Transcendence, according to Shankara, Ibn Arabi, and Meister Eckhart. Three of the most sublime metaphysicians. Shankara, of course, the 18th century Vedantin. Ibn Arabi, I'm sure you all know. Meister Eckhart, the medieval mystic, theologian, philosopher, metaphysician. So what's the difference? A saint is someone who has purified their being. They've expelled the obscurations and defilements which we're all subject to, and they have attained a state of purity whereby they are able to be a vehicle for the divine light. This does not mean they can answer recondite questions about the ultimate reality or write weighty tomes about metaphysics. Christianity is full of such saints. I'm sure there are saints in other saints in the Christian tradition who would not in any sense be metaphysicians. My favourite example would be Teresa of Lisieux, a saint of the most ravishing purity and simplicity and perfection. You can't imagine Teresa of Lisieux worrying about a metaphysical problem. It would just be something completely outside her ambit. And her mode of being, her mode of knowing is totally saturated with Jesus Christ. It's Christ-centred. The whole thing is pervaded by that fragrance, we might say. So metaphysicians are people of a different order. Now, of course, some metaphysicians are saints, but not necessarily so, although they will be if they have followed the implications of the metaphysics through to the end. This requires a kind of spiritual transformation. Metaphysics, as metaphysical understanding, as Schuon says, does not prevent titans from falling. And in fact, there is a great danger of titans falling if metaphysical knowledge is not transformed by faith and prayer, two subjects which I'll get to shortly. Okay, I've got a whole lot more to say about reason, but I'm taking too long, so we'll jump over all that and we can come back to it later if we want to. I'll just finish that point with this quote from I like this quote. Metaphysics is something quite other than the philosophical thought that believes it can attain to an absolute contact with reality by means of analyses, syntheses, arrangements, filtrations, and polishings. In other words, philosophical discourse, philosophical inquiry. Thought that is mundane by the very fact of this ignorance, and because it is a vicious circle which not merely provides no escape from illusion, but which even reinforces it through the lure of a progressive knowledge, which in fact is non-existent. A wonderful epitaph for the last 400 years of Western philosophy, which somewhere else Schuon calls, modern Western philosophy calls, the codification of an infirmity, which is rather nicely put. Okay, so we've had the first three propositions. Number 4, metaphysics belongs to the esoteric domain. Metaphysics, like esotericism generally, is not for everybody. We can't all be esoterists. We certainly can't all be metaphysicians. It's only a few people that have the contemplative intelligence, as well as the necessary personal and moral qualities. It's only a few people who can really penetrate into the inner chamber, so to speak. As Schuon reminds us, if we want a sort of capsule statement about esotericism, Schuon reminds us of this. Exoterism consists in identifying transcendent realities with the dogmatic forms. That's exotericism. Identifying transcendent realities with the dogmatic forms, and if need be, with the historical facts of a given revelation. Whereas esotericism refers in a more or less direct manner to these same realities. Esotericism, the divide, is comparable to the difference between a description of a mountain and direct vision of it. But the important point here, the second, that is direct vision, the second no more puts us on top of the mountain than the first, but it does inform us about the properties of the mountain and the route to follow. Let us not, however, forget that a blind man who walks without stopping advances more quickly than a normal man who stops at every step. Okay. Here we might have a quote from Marco Pallas about the somewhat difficult relations between exotericism and esotericism in any particular traditional framework. What one always needs to remember, says Pallas, is that the traditional forms, dogmas, rituals, all the rest of it, traditional forms, including those now bearing the unpopular name of dogmas, are keys to unlock the gate of unitive truth. But they are also, since a key can close as well as open a gate, possible obstacles to the profoundest knowledge. So going back to some of the things I was talking about the other day, metaphysical discernment, metaphysical knowledge really depends on the capacity to see through the forms, to go beyond the forms, not to dispense with them, not to throw them away, but to go further, to see where the forms are pointing, so to speak. Forms are signposts. Very easy to stop at the form, but like a signpost, if you're trying to get somewhere, there's no point in finding the same signpost and standing there staring at the signpost. You've got to do what the signpost's telling you, which is go, move, keep moving, go that way. That's what forms are for. They're to keep us moving in a certain direction. And they're certainly not to worship forms as such. As I was saying the other day, they're all means to an end, as Schuon himself says. Okay, so that's number 4, metaphysics. Metaphysics belongs to the esoteric domain. 5, to be fully realised, metaphysics demands the engagement of the whole person and disciplined spiritual practice. Any intelligent person with a certain level of intelligence and with enough effort can understand metaphysical doctrines here. Not everyone can do that. Not everyone can understand metaphysical doctrines, but all that's required for the first step, at least, is some intelligence, nothing exceptional or extraordinary. You can understand what a metaphysical doctrine means as it is stated. But that's just a superficial thing. That's a superficial understanding. Doesn't mean very much until it is transformed into something else. This is a passage I found in one of my favourite Schuon books, which is Spiritual Perspectives and Human Facts. One of the first things I read of Schuon many years ago, this passage leapt out at me, grabbed me by the throat. Knowledge saves. Knowledge saves us on condition that it enlists all that we are. Only when it is away and when it works and transforms and wounds our nature, even as the plough wounds the soil which it tills and which transforms and which wounds our nature as the plough wounds the earth. Metaphysical knowledge is sacred. It is the right of sacred things to demand of man all that he is. In other words, metaphysics is not an intellectual plaything, not something for dilettantes. It's not something to mess about with and amuse yourself with and entertain yourself with. You've either got to get serious or get out of there, go elsewhere, because it is very demanding. It demands this kind of transformation. If it is to be realised, if it's to be actualised, if it's to be internalised, which of course is the end in view. The total exigency of sacred doctrine results from the fact that the human intelligence is by definition capable of objectivity and transcendence and implies ipso facto the same capacity for the will and for the feeling soul. So three things, intelligence, feeling, will. These three things all have to be engaged if we are to fathom the metaphysical depths. Just as our intelligence is fully human only through truths concerning God and our last ends, so too is our will fully human only through its operative participation in these truths, and similarly, our soul is human only by its morality, its detachment and its magnanimity, hence by its love of the truth and the way. Okay, so here we need to make a distinction between intellection and realisation. Intellection, a mode of understanding that goes beyond ratiocination and empirical observation and all of that. Realisation being the transmutation of our soul in the light of this knowledge. So what is that? That is the spiritual life. That's what we need, the spiritual life. The spiritual life is the bridge between truth and virtue. Truth and virtue. Before we move on to the next point, the moral exigency of metaphysical discernment means that virtue is a part of wisdom. A wisdom without virtue is, in fact, imposture and hypocrisy. Plenary knowledge of the divine reality presupposes or demands moral conformity to this reality as the eye necessarily conforms to light, since the object to be known is the sovereign good. The knowing subject must correspond to it analogically. So elsewhere, Schuon says this: human nature contains dark elements. We all know that. Human nature contains dark elements. We all have dark elements, most of us anyway, unless we're a lot further along the path than I am. Human nature contains dark elements which no intellectual certainty could, ipso facto, eliminate. That is to say, a kind of grasp of a metaphysical truth is only the start of the journey. It doesn't eliminate these dark elements. To eliminate the dark elements, we need something more. What is that something more that we need? Well, you could give a very long and complicated answer to this, and Schuon himself does. In fact, a lot of his work is the confrontation with this exact question. But for today, we're going to get to two answers. I'm jumping ahead a bit. Two answers are faith and prayer. Faith and prayer. But let me just take a few minutes to circle around a couple of other points. Okay, we're up to point number 6. Spirituality is the bridge between truth and virtue. Before I get on to what Schuon says about this, there's a quote I like from Swami Abhishektananda, a Benedictine monk, or so, who's India immersed himself in Vedanta. Spiritual experience is the meeting place of the known. Schuon says spirituality stands in a sense between metaphysical truth and human virtue. It has an absolute need of both metaphysical truth and human virtue that can be reduced to neither. Spiritual life revolves around truth and the will. The one must penetrate the other. Okay, I talked a little bit the other day about spirituality and the way it is misunderstood, a term that's kind of abused a lot in modern discourse. Schuon summarises spirituality as the love of God, which is first attachment of the intelligence to the truth, then the attachment of the will to the good, and finally the attachment of the soul to peace, or we could easily, just as easily there, say beauty, the attachment of the soul to peace, which is given by truth and the good. So, in other words, it's obvious, isn't it? It's obvious. Spirituality is not just a matter of what's going on in the mind, not just a matter of ideas, not just a matter of formulations of one sort and another. It's a matter of engaging the will and the affections, the feelings. All of these must be operative in the spiritual life. Without the engagement of the will and of the emotions, the rest's like chaff in the wind. 7, the virtues are rooted in the consciousness of certain realities. I like this way of Schuon defines virtue. A spiritual virtue, he says, is nothing other than consciousness of a reality. Consciousness of a reality. To each metaphysical truth is attached a spiritual attitude, and to each spiritual attitude is attached a moral quality. So here we need to talk a little bit about the difference between virtue and morality. So a virtue is a state of being, considered from a certain point of view, a state of being. Well, what's morality? Well, morality is to do with behaviour, to do with activity, to be with the way we are in the world, and it's usually cultivated and nurtured and nourished by the observance of a moral code. We're enjoined to do certain things and enjoined not to do other things in the moral code appropriate to our tradition. And these moral codes will vary from tradition to tradition. So what might be forbidden in one tradition might be enjoined in another. In other words, the moral codes are relative, but the virtues are the same everywhere. And the virtues are the ultimate end of the spiritual life in all traditions. Each tradition might foreground or privilege a certain virtue that's central to that particular spiritual economy. Righteousness, obedience of the law, say, in Judaism, or compassion in Buddhism, or submission and remembrance in Islam. So each tradition will accent the ensemble of virtues in a different way, but All of the virtues are there in all of the traditions. There's no tradition which treasures pride or hypocrisy or dishonesty or hardness of heart. They all enjoy the corresponding virtues: humility, compassion, patience, generosity, honesty, and so on. Okay, that was number 7. 8, faith is indispensable in the spiritual life. Now, faith's another one of those words like spirituality that's bandied about the place and we're not quite sure what it means. What it often seems to mean is, especially by critics of religion, means a sort of blind belief in implausible propositions, clinging to beliefs for which there is no apparent evidence. That's what they seem to think faith is. That's not what faith is. Here's what Schuon says. One can meditate or speculate indefinitely on transcendent truths and their applications. That, moreover, is what the author of this book, Schuon himself, does, but he has valid reasons for doing so, nor does he do it for himself. One can spend a whole lifetime speculating on the suprasensorial and the transcendent, but all that matters is the leap into the void, the faith, this leap into the void, the fixation of the spirit and soul in an unthinkable dimension of the real. And this is a necessary and indispensable complement to metaphysical speculation, metaphysical discernment, metaphysical exposition, whatever. Here's a very striking passage from Schuon. I'm nearly finished. Just bear with me for a few more minutes. Faith as a quality of the soul is the stabilizing complement of the discerning and, as it were, explosive intelligence. Without this complement, intellectual activity lets itself be carried away by its own movement, and is like a devouring fire. It loses its balance and ends either by devouring itself in a restlessness without issue, or else by simply wearing itself out, the point of sclerosis. Faith implies all that is gentle and static, qualities such as patience, gratitude, confidence, generosity. It offers the mercurial intelligence a fixative element, and thus realises, together with discernment, an equilibrium, which is like the anticipation of sainthood. So faith, you can see, is central to the whole spiritual life, the whole spiritual exercise. All right, nearly finished. So faith, that's number 8. Faith is indispensable in the spiritual life. 9, prayer is the gateway to eternity. I circle back to my ruminations about time with which we started 4 days ago. Prayer is the gateway to eternity. In other words, prayer is the way in which we liberate ourselves, free ourselves from time, from the contingencies of time, from all the things that imprison us in this particular place, at this particular time, everything that's bearing in on us from the outside world, all of our past experience, ever since we came to life. Prayer is the way out of all of this. Prayer is the royal road to freedom. And Schuon writes about prayer so wonderfully, so eloquently, so movingly. Some of his most sublime passages are concerned with prayer, and I will finish with just one of these. Prayer, in the widest sense, triumphs over the 4 accidents of our existence: the world, life, the body, the soul. Or we might also say space, time, matter, desire. It is situated in existence like a shelter, like an islet. In it alone we are perfectly ourselves because it puts us in the presence of God. It is like a diamond which nothing can tarnish and nothing can resist. In another passage he says, it's the same thing really. Prayer is the triumph over the four accidents of existence: the world or space, life, time, the body, matter, the soul, desire. He also says in renunciation, this is all part of prayer, in renunciation, the soul leaves the world. Soul leaves the world. In purification, the world leaves the soul. Right? In renunciation, the soul leaves the world. In purification, the world leaves the soul. In meditation, God enters the soul. In continual prayer, particularly invocatory prayer, in continual prayer, the soul enters God. The soul enters God. I'll finish with this. This is, if I had to just preserve one passage of Schuon for eternity, just one passage limited to a few words, this is it. Man prays, and prayer fashions man. The saint has himself become prayer, the meeting place of earth and heaven. He thereby contains the universe, and the universe prays with him. He is everywhere where nature prays. He prays with her and in her, in the peaks which touch the void and eternity, in a flower which scatters its scent, in the carefree song of a bird. He who lives in prayer has not lived in vain. Thank you very much.